Every day, the world presents you with hundreds of headlines. What do you believe? Who do you trust? The Financial Times cuts through complexity with clarity, accuracy, and global perspective. Its journalism is guided by independence, not agendas. That's why leaders in business, policy, and culture turn to one trusted source. For facts, for insight, for what matters next. Source FT. Read more and subscribe at ft.com.
You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 4th of November 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Dick Cheney, the most powerful US vice president, dies at 84. Russia attempts to make Ukraine's looming winter even colder. And how would you enliven proceedings in the European Parliament? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Terry Stiastny and Robin Brandt will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the leadership lecturer Claire York about her new book explaining how the commendable sentiment of empathy can be applied as practical politics. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Terry Stiastny, political journalist and author, and Robin Brandt, former BBC presenter and correspondent in China and the United States. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hi.
Terry, do you join us once again with tales from the book flogging circuit?
I do. I have most recently been in Ilkley, which is in Yorkshire, and actually a really lovely, another of these places in this country that I had never actually been to before. And so, yes, I was up there talking about psychological warfare with another author who's also written an interesting book on the CIA and the Cold War. And it was, very good fun, and got a chance to go and wander around the moors, as you do.
What goes on in Ilkley, as far as you are able to determine?
It seems to be an incredibly outdoorsy sort of place. I mean, everybody there on a Saturday morning had either been to Park Run, was going on a bike ride, was hiking on the moors. And every other shop in the high street sells fleeces. It's that kind of place.
God, sounds exhausting. It is a beautiful part of the world, however. Certainly you could end up doing book tours in worse places. You have, Terry, clearly remiss and have learnt nothing from your experience, failed to seamlessly several times weave the title of your book into your narrative.
Of my book, Believable Lies,
That's
which is about fake news and wartime black propaganda.
Okay.
All rights still available for film and TV. Stop there.
That title again, Terry.
Believable Lies.
Robin, you were promising in the waiting room that you would have some absolutely red-hot light introductory banter.
Look, I'm not a published author. There's much talk when I returned from China about, do you have a book in you, Robin? All the American journalists have a book in them. I had 2 dogs, 3 kids. I worked a lot. I kept good notes, but frankly, I didn't go anywhere near, and I don't have the discipline that I know Terry has to be a published author. I was talking today, funnily enough, with a colleague of mine about the potential of going back to China in March or April of next year. Incidentally, I think President Trump is going to be there at the same time, and that for me would be the first time back since 2022. So the prospect of that is exciting, perhaps potentially as well a source of some anxiety. But for me today, it's not so much about places we've been, but potentially places might be going.
China being China, though, are you braced for the fact that even after as short an interregnum as 3 years, you'll go back and go, God, what's happened? I don't recognise anything.
Yeah, I mean, the place will be radically different. Actually, and joking aside, in terms of technological and architectural progress, I think what's most interesting, and you get this clearly from people you speak to, from what you read, is sentiment. It is confidence among people, particularly in the city of Shanghai, where I used to live, and that consumer confidence in particular, and that confidence in their government and their ability to look after them. That's very different, certainly, to what it was in those pre-COVID days of 2019.
Well, we will start in the United States, where former Vice President Dick Cheney has died aged 84. We will have more on his legacy from our panellists shortly, but here first is an excerpt of Monocle Radio's obituary. The Vice Presidency of the United States is one of the strangest jobs in global politics. The holder of the office is all at once extremely close to awesome power, yet miles away from any power at all. So long as the occupant of the White House stays healthy and lucky, the Vice President is usually a ceremonial eunuch, sent on diplomatic visits to ghastly places the President can't be bothered with, engaged to speak at state fairs teeming with uncomprehending riffraff, or confined to their opulent quarters, wistfully reading biographies of John Wilkes Booth. Richard Bruce Cheney was never going to be one of those vice presidents. He was born in Lincoln, Nebraska on January 30th, 1941, and raised substantially in Casper, Wyoming. He was a bright but wayward young man, smart enough to get into Yale, not disciplined enough to stay there, and a repeat customer of Wyoming's traffic police. He was, like many middle-class young American men, a serial dodger of the Vietnam draft, in his case by being an apparently perpetual student, then a married man before 26, then a father. It was waspishly noted that his first daughter, Elizabeth, later a politician herself, was born 9 months and 2 days after the draft was extended to married men without children. Cheney's ascent of the political greasy pole began properly in 1969. Having finally completed his political science studies, he became an intern to Wisconsin's Republican Congressman William Steiger. Shortly afterwards, Cheney began making himself useful to former Illinois Congressman, now counselor to President Richard M. Nixon, Donald Rumsfeld. Dick Cheney acquired a reputation as an efficient functionary and survived his service in Nixon's administration unscathed by its implosion following the Watergate scandal. So did his mentor, Donald Rumsfeld, who had been serving as ambassador to NATO in Brussels. Nixon's successor, President Gerald Ford, engaged Rumsfeld as White House Chief of Staff with Cheney as his deputy. When Rumsfeld was appointed Secretary of Defense, Cheney inherited the Chief of Staff's job, gatekeeper to the Oval Office. Cheney did not keep it long. Ford lost the 1976 presidential election to Jimmy Carter, but Cheney was not done with politics. In 1978, he sought and won Wyoming's only seat in the House of Representatives. He was re-elected 5 times and rose to become House Minority Whip and chair of the House Republican Conference. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush named him Secretary of Defense, in which role Cheney oversaw the U.S. invasion of Panama in late 1989 and the U.S.-led eviction of Iraqi forces from Kuwait in early 1991. Cheney's progress in politics was interrupted again by Bush's loss of the 1992 presidential election.
And now I ask that we stand behind our new president, and regardless of our differences, all Americans share the same purpose, to make this, the world's greatest nation, more safe and more secure, and to guarantee every American a shot at the American dream.
There was some vague talk of Cheney seeking the Republican nomination himself someday, but 3 key factors always weighed against it. His health was rickety. He suffered recurrent heart attacks from his late 30s onwards. He would have a heart transplant in 2012. He was protective of his second daughter Mary, a gay woman whose private life would have become public. And he was a notably dismal public speaker.
I have no restrictions at this point in terms of my own activities. With respect to my background in the defense area, it's an issue that set of issues that I've been interested in for a long time.
Cheney spent much of the 1990s making money as CEO of the colossal energy services multinational Halliburton. He was summoned back to public office by Texas Governor George W. Bush, seeking to bolster his own tilt at the presidency by putting an experienced heavyweight on the ticket. If Cheney, once Bush's narrow victory was eventually confirmed in 2000, had doubts about what he might make of the vice presidency, events, specifically the events of September 11, 2001, clarified matters for him. Significantly at Cheney's urging, Bush presented the pair of them to the world, to the Middle East especially, as bad cop and worse cop.
All of this was brought upon us in a single day. And night fell on a different world, a world where freedom itself is under attack.
While Bush gave the jut-jawed speeches, Cheney seethed in an assortment of bunkers, scheming to vanquish enemies real, potential, and altogether imaginary.
The United States made our position clear. We could not accept the grave danger of Saddam Hussein and his terrorist allies turning weapons of mass destruction against us or our friends and allies.
He was a significant architect of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, amplifying intelligence about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, which was widely believed dubious at the time and eventually proved entirely bogus. He was an aggressive enthusiast of the brutal and debatably effective tactics which became known by such sinister euphemisms as enhanced interrogation and extraordinary rendition. Cheney's vice presidency was a rebuke to that hefty lexicon of jokes about the impotence of the office. He made himself the most powerful person ever to hold it, and for the first 8 years of the 21st century, one of the most powerful people on earth. It is probably arguable that some of what Cheney did with that power, even if furtively and unaccountably, made his fellow citizens safer, but that presents the difficulty of measuring terror attacks which never happened. It is certain, however, that Dick Cheney played a key role in unleashing a war which grievously and lastingly damaged America's reputation and moral authority. He left office with an approval rating among his fellow Americans of 13%, probably not all that far in front of Osama bin Laden. And that was Monocle Radio's obituary for US Vice President Dick Cheney, who has died aged 84. Robin, first of all, I mean, the thing that struck me about listening to that obituary back, which I did record a while ago, is how long ago Bush and Cheney now seem. And it's not that long ago at all. Is there, though, a legacy as such, or has the world, the United States, in particular the Republican Party, moved on so dramatically that you can't see any traces of Dick Cheney for better or for worse anywhere?
Well, the Republican Party is very, very different. A vehicle dominated by Donald Trump and his MAGA acolytes, and so different, in fact, that, of course, Dick Cheney famously turned against Trump's Republicans and turned against the Republican Party and voted, we're told, for Kamala Harris at the last election. But if we look at things like Cheney's belief in the presidency, the belief in unitary executive power resting within the presidency, his belief that post-Nixon things had, the pendulum had swung too much towards the Congress, too much away from the White House, then we see shades of that in the way that Donald Trump conducts his presidency. We see shades of that in recent rulings by the Supreme Court that has appeared to give Donald Trump, the current president, and future presidents to come, an immunity almost around their decisions whilst in the White House. And so that is similar in a way. That ties the Cheney era together with the Trump era and the kind of that shared belief in what the presidency is and the power, the executive power that it should have.
I mean, it does tell us, I think, something about the state of the modern United States, Terry, that the current Republican Party managed to alienate even Dick Cheney. But is it necessarily surprising, again, for better and for worse, that Cheney in his later years should have become an out and proud member of the resistance? A total never-Trumper, as was his daughter Liz Cheney, and as Robin said, made it publicly clear that he did vote for Vice President Harris last time round.
Yeah, I think it's a sign of, exactly as Robin says, how much the Republican Party has changed and how much even, an arch hawk, an arch conservative in every respect, Dick Cheney, for all his faults, he did have a line to draw somewhere, and he did see January the 6th as absolutely the kind of line that should not be crossed. And I think one of the other interesting things about him and the politicians of his generation and, say, of Joe Biden's generation, which I think is not the case now. I mean, there's a lot of people who've been around for an awfully long time in American politics, which is not always a good thing. just how long he had been working in Washington and in US politics. I mean, someone that came in, as you said there, in the Nixon-Ford era and went on to have positions in government in one way or another for, a good 30 years. I mean, it's just, amazing the length of sort of institutional memory that is there. And I think, a lot of that is probably going to be lost within the next few years.
Well, to Ukraine now, currently contemplating a third full winter of war, and a reminder at this point that winter comes early in most of the country. Kyiv is anticipating its first sub-zero temperatures of the year next week, its first snow the week after. Russia's recent barrages have been pretty clearly directed with a view to making winter as long and as cold as possible, striking gas facilities and other energy infrastructure. There has been criticism directed at Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky for not attending to the decentralization of Ukraine's power grid as swiftly as he might have, but as much of that criticism is being directed by a former CEO of state power company Ukrenergo, who is currently on the hook on embezzlement charges, it may not be altogether unbiased. Robin, is this one of those things where we might actually be looking at this the wrong way, that it's actually surprising that Russia hasn't hit Ukraine's energy harder over 3 years? And I'm thinking back to when the war started 3.5 years ago. There were widespread assumptions that Russia would just close Ukraine down, would just switch off all the lights.
Yes, and there was an expectation. I mean, firstly, let's remember that certainly by those around Vladimir Putin that they would walk into Ukraine and it would be over very quickly. But what fascinates me about the story that we're particularly talking about today is that much of this war is likely to turn not necessarily on those tactical gains on the field around the front line, which we continue to see some for Russia, but nonetheless it would appear a much more broader military stalemate between these two countries. But the efforts to bring the country to a halt in a way away from the military field, I think is something that we all expected would be far more effective and would be far more ruthlessly prosecuted by Russia and by its military. And yet it hasn't. And in fact, what we have seen is Ukraine managing to turn the tables, and with the support of the UK and others in Europe in terms of some of the most sophisticated and some of the most long-range military missile hardware, is that Ukraine actually deciding to do to Russia what Russia is attempting to do to Ukraine. And I wonder if that has changed the kind of the military calculations in Moscow and made things even more challenging, and of course a much higher risk as well for Putin and for Russia's military leaders.
Terry, it is difficult to tell at this distance whether there is anything to the charges against Vladimir Kudrytsky, who is the former CEO of Ukrenergo. But it is noticeable that he does have a lot of people, certainly outside Ukraine, who are usually favourably disposed to President Zelensky on his side. This is not for the first time a suggestion that Zelensky is using the rule of law as an apparatus for whacking his domestic political opposition.
Yes, I mean, I think, this is just another example of how, we tend to think, and looking back at, say, for instance, the Second World War, that during wartime, normal domestic politics stops. And of course, it doesn't. And there is always infighting. There is always political blame. And, Ukrainian politics has always been incredibly complicated in terms of, people making accusations against one another. So I think, possibly, of course, Kudrytsky thinks he feels, not surprisingly, that he's being made a scapegoat. But must have been very difficult to run an energy sector where you are constantly trying to rebuild something that is being damaged. And yes, there seems to have been a disagreement about, what's the best way to plan for the future. But I think anyone who had been in that job, I mean, yes, Zelensky's got ideas about let's have more foreign investment, let's have alternative energy plans. But constantly you must be just repatching something that, unless you keep doing it, just isn't going to work anymore.
Robin, I want to go back to that point about, you did mention Ukraine in recent weeks and months, indeed, deciding to sort of see how Russia likes it and taking potshots at Russia's energy infrastructure. Is there any reason to imagine that might actually change the dynamic, though? Because we've seen 2 winters that Ukrainians have fought through and their morale has not cracked. Is there any reason for hoping that it would be any different in the other direction?
No, I don't think there is. But what it is proof that Ukraine can procure this weaponry, is able to effectively use them, and is able to counter what Russia's military is doing to it in terms of its energy network. And of course, it also demonstrates to Russia's people, many of whom don't support the prosecution of this war, that they are just as vulnerable as the people in Kyiv and around Ukraine when it comes to where their opponent may choose to target. And the idea, as I said at the beginning, that this was going to be a war prosecuted quickly and effectively and over within weeks, as we all know, has not come to fruition. And attacks like this, using military hardware given or bought from the Brits and others, are both a demonstration and a reminder to Russia's people that they are just as vulnerable. And it is not the easy win that President Vladimir Putin said it would be.
And on which subject, Terry, and just finally, it is hard to know whether to be encouraged or despondent at the fact that after 3.5 years of this nonsense, Russia, having failed to take much more of Ukraine than it had 3.5 years ago, has not come up with any other ideas, any better ideas, even by Russia's own merits and from Russia's own viewpoint.
No, and we don't seem to have got any further, for all, we had sort of meetings, discussions between Trump and Putin that seem to have, run into the ground again. There doesn't seem to be any further serious discussion about, how this war actually ends, because it comes up against the fundamental issue that Ukraine says, well, no, we are not giving up the territory that we have been fighting for the last 3.5 years, just like that. And we're not going to agree to people coming in over our heads and doing it. And so I think, these things, the international attention goes away from it for a while, but as time goes on, we're going to have to try and think about this again, and I don't think we have the solutions to that.
Well, to China, which is exactly the journey that King Felipe VI of Spain will be undertaking next week. This is not an entirely unprecedented endeavour. Felipe's predecessor and father, Juan Carlos, went 18 years ago, though he abdicated in 2014 amid an assortment of picturesque scandals and is now resident in Abu Dhabi. King Felipe is being sent abroad, as constitutional monarchs usually are, as essentially a greeter for his nation's commercial interests, and the visit appears kind of a crescendo of a determined pitch for China's business. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has been 3 times in the last 3 years. Robin, China, obviously a country you know well, possibly even better than Pedro Sanchez. Is it strange? I assume the Spanish have done their research into this and have sent their advance teams, but is it weird to assume that revolutionary communists are going to be terrifically excited about meeting a royal?
No, what China wants from this is healthy and improving bilateral relationships with significant European Union member states. That's partly to drive a wedge to an extent amongst the whole bloc and its leadership in Brussels when it comes to the trade relationship. It wants to have a good trading relationship with a significant EU member state like Spain. Tourism is very important for plenty of hundreds of millions of rich middle class Chinese who want to come to Europe more. They want to go to Spain more, and likewise the reciprocal side of that is a Chinese market that wants to buy increasingly Spanish fashion, Spanish food, and so there's multiple dynamics to what's going on here. These trips are, there's talk of Keir Starmer, the UK's Prime Minister, going maybe next year. President Trump is going to go in April, as I think I said a little earlier. Emmanuel Macron seems to go every other week. Protocol is important. Your head of state going and meeting Xi Jinping and others is a sign that China treats the relationship in the most serious of ways. And so this is a sign of a healthy relationship between Madrid and between Beijing. And as I said, there are multiple elements to it. Trade, particularly important for the Spanish contingent, but likewise, China and its behemoth automotive manufacturers, particularly when it comes to EV manufacturing, wants to have manufacturing bases increasingly within the European Union to try and skirt round those tariffs. And Spain is one very good place to put an EV assembly or manufacturing plant.
Counterpoint, Terry, shouldn't European countries be attempting to do actually less business with China? I bring in at this point the lesson offered in the last day or two by Norway, which has discovered that a bunch of electric buses it order from China can in fact be switched off remotely.
Well, yeah, that's it is a risk, and I think certainly within the British context, particularly over recent spying allegations and so forth within Westminster, there has been quite a lot of pushback and scepticism in terms of how close, particularly the British government should be in terms of Chinese investment and which companies should be allowed to invest and how much supervision there should be of that. But I think as Robin's saying, it's in China's interest to try to work with different countries within the EU or like Britain outside the EU to try and say, well, look, what deals can we do on the side that aren't just sort of one block to another big country, but to try and persuade people, like in terms of the tariffs on electric vehicles, that maybe bit by bit you can sort of get these deals done.
And we turn now to the European Parliament, which is apparently contemplating ways to make the European Parliament more fun, as if anything could be more fun than arguing over the minutiae of herring quotas. The Parliament's President, Roberto Metsola, has noted correctly that what are supposed to be debates are much more often the dreary recital of tedious talking points which even the people reading them out loud don't want to listen to. She has therefore solicited suggestions from the political group chairs, none of which include, regrettably, sword fights or a gunge tank. Robin, is this actually a reasonable concern? Like, I'm sure it is terrifically tedious, and Lord knows I don't sit down of an evening and tune into the European Parliament. But are they perhaps slipping towards the delusion which has had such dreadful consequences all over the world that politics must be exciting and entertaining? Yeah,
I think a better way I would suggest... I mean, look, it's important that we have transparency when it comes to the legislative process, of which, of course, the UK is no longer a part. But for the other member states, having that transparency, being able to have that access, being able to see their country's legislators doing their job is very important. And so, that might sound slightly high and mighty, but being able to see the proceedings, being able to understand the proceedings and having a level of transparency there, I think is important. I would suggest a better way to make this seem more relevant, make it seem more accessible, make it seem, dare I say, just a bit more fun, is to encourage the legislators independently and individually to pursue their own kind of, communications strategies, whether that's TikTok, whether that's Insta or whatever it is. I think the idea that you can change these proceedings, which of course are built around, heavily institutionalized rules and regulations and are often dominated by, politicians just trying to make a particular point for their own domestic audience. I think the idea that you can suddenly transform and change that and make it into something more theatrical, more appealing, I don't quite buy that myself.
Is there, though, Terry, somewhere at the heart of this, a genuine question or indeed crisis of legitimacy for the European Parliament? Because turnouts in European parliamentary elections are by and large shocking. It's barely covered by media. I suspect if you walk the streets of EU capitals asking passers-by, can you name a single member of the European Parliament, you might be trying a while before you got a correct answer.
Yes, and I think that this leads to one of the problems. I mean, from my sins, I have covered quite a lot of European Parliament plenary sessions in Brussels and Strasbourg, and they are mostly incredibly dull. But because they're dull, that allows people who know how to exploit the media, and I'm thinking of Nigel Farage in the past or Le Pen, and you always had these characters. So you had, Danny Cohn-Bendit or Otto Habsburg. Those were the people that people could latch onto and say, well, that person's quite interesting. But then they would sit and just kind of go off on one and pretend protest or kick off. And so that attracted all the attention. But if you could actually say, we will have a decent kind of a question time to the commissioners where we will be a bit more like Prime Minister's questions and ask them hard questions rather than a very, very dull set of questions. And it's always made more dull by the fact it's got to be translated into several languages. So you can't really have that cut and thrust, because if someone makes a witty barb, it's then got to be translated into, 25 languages. So it is quite hard to do that. But there is, because, the Parliament can't do that much. And so unless you are questioning the commissioners, it's ultimately the commissioners and the member states that have still got the power. And so, yes, they were always talking when I was there about having more democratic accountability and getting people more engaged. And it's really, really hard to do.
Terry Stiastny and Robin Brandt, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it has become axiomatic in leftward political circles that empathy is a self-evident virtue. It is at the very least hard to argue that it isn't preferable to the venal sociopathy often witnessed at large among the contemporary right. But what does empathy actually look like or result in when practically applied? This is considered in a new book by Claire York, Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Future Defence and National Security at Deakin University in Canberra. The book is called Empathy in Politics and Leadership, the Key to Transforming Our World. I spoke to Claire at Midori House earlier and began by asking if she had a hard and fast definition of empathy, or if we just kind of know it when we see it.
So for me, empathy is something that in many ways is built into politics. I think a lot of politicians, against the perception we may have of them, actually do enter politics because they care about issues, they care about people. But what I argue is that actually there's different ideas of empathy. It has different roles. And I make a distinction especially between sincere empathy, which is that real kind of care-motivated idea of transforming politics to help people, and then performative empathy, which you see in the more rhetorical use of it, which a lot of politicians maybe use but don't follow through on.
Which is a partial answer to a question I wanted to ask, which you do write, I think, in the conclusion, spoiler alert, that empathy in politics should be empathy in action. So is it often used as a device to actually avoid doing anything? This is the politician who says, I feel your pain, and then does absolutely nothing to ameliorate it. Exactly.
And that's the danger, is that empathy right now is such a buzzword in politics that it can become something that we hear a lot of, and it's rolled out to signal care. But it has to be matched by actual policies that start to go out to citizens and engage more with communities about, well, what does effective politics mean for you? How can we make more people feel seen and heard by political systems? And how do we actually recreate some of our politics so that it's much more people-focused, people-centric, and deals with the real issues? Because we're missing that in a lot of politics. Some of the real tough issues of the day, economic inequality, social justice, welfare, it's not really being tackled head-on. It's always around the margin with the language of care, but not the action.
How would, then, a greater application of empathy, as you see it, get us towards positive outcomes in any of those spheres? For example, cost of living, and I guess that's when you're asking politicians to empathise with how tough it is to feed an entire family when you don't own your own place and you're making less money than they do. But how do we get from that to actually something being done about that?
It's about creating processes and systems where we open up politics. So it's not just done by a very narrow group of people, that we start to bring citizens more into the process of the doing politics, of thinking about what we need. We need more politicians to be listening to what people need to see, what challenges they're facing, and being able to also ask the questions and interrogate what's going on here beneath the surface. And I actually think a lot of politicians do that, but often the systems and structures of politics itself makes that harder. It often obscures the capacity to create change. So it's about building in dialogue, it's getting better at tackling the real issues and listening to diverse perspectives to really figure out, well, what is needed here? And a core argument of the book is we've got to start empowering more citizens, because the people on the front line of our politics, the people who are on the front line of welfare cuts, who are on the front line of health services, they're the people who know what's needed and what needs to change. So how do we bring that back into the centre?
I mean, have you seen or did you encounter in your research any practical examples of somebody having a crack at this and actually getting results with it?
I've been really encouraged by citizens' assemblies. I know that they maybe have their critics as well, but I find that by actually creating these spaces where people get exposure to the issues, and also in turn where citizens learn the challenges that face politicians who are trying to make complex decisions with a wide array of information, that these citizens' assemblies create space for those conversations and also for exposure to evidence. We need to still have evidence-based politics and decisions based on that. And so there's some interesting initiatives in France, and there's interesting organisations as well like Democracy Next, who are really trying to change the culture and make it far more normal that we hold these assemblies, that we start to meet with people who think differently.
Is the argument there that empathy is a two-way street, that there perhaps needs to be a little bit more of it among the led for the leaders? Because what you talk about there is a common complaint that I've heard from politicians when talking off the record, a thing they could not possibly ever say in public, that they're just incredibly frustrated with the fact that people don't understand how government and politics actually work and don't want to listen when it's explained to them.
Yeah, I definitely think it has to work both ways, that we need to get a greater sense of what is involved in politics, what are the compromises, what are the trade-offs, what are the decisions they're making, and the complexity of it. And I think that's partly to do with the exposure we have to news. Do we have news media that's actually giving us access to that complexity, that's not just reducing what's going on in the world to neat sound bites? And do we have politicians who don't just play to the gallery? We need to have politicians who can stand up and really say, look, this is what we're dealing with. These are the trade-offs we've got. And that requires integrity as a leader, and it requires courage, because it's often not going to be popular. You're not going to get that immediate boost in your polls when you come out and you say, this situation we're facing is actually a bit difficult, but here's how we're going to do it.
Should there be limits to that empathy, though, in a political leader? And this is me shamelessly inserting my own personal prejudice into the conversation. Is there ever a case for a leader with due sincerity, integrity, addressing specific people on a specific issue and saying, you're just wrong and you're mad?
I mean, I wonder if it's helpful to call people just mad, but I think we do need leaders who can say, I don't agree with you on this point and this is why. And this is the thing, empathy can have boundaries and it can have standards. And there's often criticism that empathy is just being nice or it's too soft. And actually, it's very hard. It takes a lot of courage to do empathy well. And we need to have people who can stand up and say, this is what I think. This is why I think it. I'll listen to you and I'm open to you changing my mind if you have a compelling case. But there's certain standards that we need to hold at the same time. But I think most people trust politicians when they express conviction and when it's matched by action. But that can often be hard to come by.
Final question then. If any particular politician may happen to pick up your book and think this all sounds great and I'd like to have a go at it, unfortunately, I am an unregenerate sociopath. Is this something that can actually be taught, or do you need to be sort of bored with it?
Absolutely. You can teach this, you can practice it. And I think it's important that we accept that it's not always going to be perfect. It's variable. And we're going to encounter certain issues where we struggle more than others in our own politics. And I've studied this for 10 years now, and I still have gaps in empathy. But it's something that the more we do, the better we'll get at it. The more we learn to hold space for different perspectives and to have those conversations and to lean in and be curious, the better we get. And also the more we model that it's possible. And that's the challenge right now. We're not seeing this. We're seeing divisive rhetoric. We're seeing that easy division into camps. And we need people who can say there's another way of doing politics and who can then model ways of holding those conversations, of showing they can look at people who think differently to themselves with dignity and respect, even if they fundamentally disagree, and stop really humiliating or putting down those who think very differently.
That was Claire York speaking to me earlier. Her new book is called Empathy in Politics and Leadership, The Key to Transforming Our World. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Terry Stiastny and Robin Brandt. The show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Joanna Moser. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.